Right, absolutely, and I think that's what it is. A lot of it. Whenever you hear.
Yeah, we.
Oh! You're listening to the GWP Season 2 finale. I'm your host, Isaac Hedges, joined by co-host Jake Fulmer. Jake, what do you have for us today?
Today we will continue talking about AI glasses, discuss genetic modification, cryopreservation, mind uploading, and space colonization.
Alright, a lot of great stuff. Let's get right into it.
Yes, we will go ahead and start off by just reminding you, please tune in to March Madness tonight to watch the Final Four.
Yeah, tune in for that. You won't want to miss it. It'll be interesting to see who wins.
And to see who makes it to the national championship, which you can find 48 hours from now, Monday night.
Big deal.
Yes, just like these AI glasses that we were discussing in the last episode.
Just like those AI glasses. So, recently we covered those AI glasses, and of course we have found out that those were involved in the New Year's attack in the city of New Orleans, and they had a little problem with that. The guy that actually was kind of responsible for this attack, he was using these AI glasses, and by the look of it at the time, you wouldn't have really known, because now they look like ordinary glasses, like made of glasses where they've partnered with Ray-Ban. They look like they're actual glasses, just ordinary old eyeglasses, sunglasses, whatever. And we talked about different, say, surveillance or security concerns on that front. Now, something the manufacturers might consider implementing to mitigate some of these issues is they have a recording light, like just a little red light that comes on whenever you're recording. So that might help with some of that. It would be a fairly minor change. So something like that. What do you think, Jay?
Yeah, I think that would be a good way, because then nobody can really hide it as much. We were talking about how that's really the biggest concern, is that you wouldn't be able to ever tell about this. But if there was a light, then you could see that somebody is actively recording something. And then if it was in maybe a setting where it wouldn't be okay to record, or if you knew that somebody was recording for bad reasons, then you'd be able to intervene at that point. Now, how would you have evidence as a police officer? That would be a little bit more difficult, but there are certain settings like a courtroom where you would know that that's just not okay.
That's an excellent question, one which we do not know the answer to yet, so if you have any input on that, we'd love to hear that. Start the discussion up, put it down in the comments below, or send it in to gwp-international@att.net. That's gwp-international@att.net. In the meantime, Jake, what else do we have going on?
Well, we have genetic modification as a next topic.
Okay, so that's like genetically modified organisms. So we're talking about different animals that have been genetically modified.
At least right now,
that
animal, research and modification is ongoing.
Okay.
But could this go to humans? Would be the real question, I think.
Right.
And so, is it right to do these experiments? What do you think?
Absolutely. So, as far as genetically modified organisms, we see a lot of it. We've seen in more recent times, where you have organic products. You've got because for a while that was all the rage. You'd be like, get the big healthy plump chickens, the ones that are genetically modified to be, fat and plump and juicy and all of that. But now we're seeing more organic things saying, it's non-GMO, because GMO isn't actually very good for you. So we've seen that in recent times, and that's not exactly something new, and we're beginning to see a little more of that, but it's really hard to say. What do you think, Jake?
Yeah, we've seen a little bit of it, but have we really seen? We've seen people illegally modify animals.
Right,
we've seen
illegal
that
modifications.
done.
That's no bueno. What kind of illegal modifications have we seen?
Well, I believe it was a farmer?
Yeah.
Back in the kind of the upper Midwest.
Mm-hmm.
Who was it? A sheep?
Was it a sheep? Okay.
I honestly don't
I
remember.
remember previously we talked about the sheep cloning with the stem cell cloning, so that's another issue that we covered. Is it possible that you're mixing those up, or
I think that might be what it is.
Okay.
Yeah, because I actually don't remember the animal that was modified, but I do know that we've seen it.
Right, we don't have exact examples of that. There certainly have been instances of illegal genetic modifications, so certainly it's possible, we know, to take that too far, but there may not be exactly a clear consensus about what exactly is too far. And with genetic modification of organisms at large. Certain animals like cows, chickens, we do this with now. We're looking at doing that to people, to give them the optimal lifespan. We've looked at things like cryopreservation. Hop in the freezer for 50 years, and then hop back out, and maybe we'll have a cure for your now lethal condition, something like that. So, what exactly is too far? That's a worthwhile question to be asked, I believe.
And how would you go through that process?
How would you go through that process of cryopreservation?
Yeah, how would one even go through that process? Would you have to, like who would have to sign off on
Well,
that?
it hasn't been done successfully to my knowledge, but the way it's been presented, as far as the concepts go, this would be sort of a medical procedure. So it would be something your doctor would be involved in, and you would have this condition, and where you would make the decision, say, oh, well, we don't know a cure for the condition that I have now, so it'd be like, freeze you up, preserve you for the next 50 years and thaw you out, then maybe we'll have a cure for that condition. So I think that is the idea of it, but at least to my knowledge, it hasn't been done successfully. Do you know of any instances where I'm sure it's been tried. Do you know?
Yeah, and how unsuccessful were those?
Right.
That's the real thing to look at there. And so the benefits of it is to hopefully find a cure for something that's
right.
uncurable at the time when the person wants to be preserved to 50 years from now.
Right, and kind of the central question there, is that really something that we ought to be doing? That seems to kind of, those sorts of things where it's like you're almost beginning to usurp the balance of nature. Is that really something that we ought to be doing? Sort of trying to play God there, so to speak. I mean, obviously, you don't want to live on Earth forever, but it's interesting. Where exactly do you draw the line?
I think any time that you're trying to do such a thing as
right, obviously
cryopreservation.
Right, cryopreservation.
Right, yeah.
Anytime you do that, yeah.
Anytime you do that, I feel like you're really messing with things that you shouldn't mess with.
Sure.
And you're really kind of tipping the balance there too far.
Sort of trying to offset the balance of nature. Yeah, offset the scales.
And I think it's a very dangerous thing to even really try.
Right.
Anytime that people have tried doing things that would normally be considered out of the bounds of nature, things haven't ended very well.
Right.
And so one example of that we can find is there was, I don't remember what country it was, but there was a country that tried drilling a hole all the way to the center of the earth.
Really? Okay, and how did that go?
Well, not very well, as the drillers actually got fired because they said that they were too afraid to do it because they heard screaming coming from the core of the earth.
Wow.
So I don't know if that's a sign or not. There's a lot of people, however, that suggest that that was because maybe they were drinking when they were doing such work.
That's possible. That's possible. In any case, that's very sort of experimental, right? Because why would you need a hole that goes through the center of the earth? I mean, what was their purpose? It was mainly experimental, wasn't it?
I think it was experimental.
For research purposes,
maybe,
like, what's there?
Maybe their overall intention was to start with research and then maybe dig a hole to another country.
Right.
Maybe they really thought they could do that.
That would be
interesting.
At that point in time. And there's always sort of been the idea of it. I don't know about you, but I remember as a kid, digging holes and be like, oh, we're gonna try and dig a hole to China and see how deep we can get, And there was something fascinating about that. Right. Didn't get quite that far.
Well, and what actually happened, they got pretty far down. They got so far down, in fact, that it was so warm that the drills started melting. And that's part of the reason.
Melting, right, because they got so close to the core of the earth that it was so hot.
So there was two reasons they couldn't finish. It's because their equipment melted and because these workers refused to do it. Mm-hmm. And they said they felt as if some supernatural force was working against them since they heard this screaming. So I've gotten a lot of different people's opinions about this, but what do you think that screaming was?
And those tend to be related. I mean, it is quite possible that the supernatural, of course, um, something to the effect of demons, I believe is possible. Could also, the obvious and natural effects. We know that as you get closer to the center of the Earth, it gets warmer and warmer. It's very hot in the center of the Earth. So, but I believe those two are closely related. What do you think?
I think it could. I mean, what do you think the screaming was?
Well, as I said, quite possibly. They believe that they felt some sort of supernatural interference. So, quite possibly, I don't know, like the cries of demons, something like that. That may be a bit wild, but I can't imagine what else it would be. Obviously, it's inhabitable by actual people, so I don't think it would be that.
Well,
you could say, oh, obviously, there's always a natural explanation for it. It possibly is. I don't know what that would be. I think, I think the natural and supernatural are closely related. What do you think?
Well, I'm going to at least look at the most interesting response that I've gotten to that question. The most interesting response was, well, when you think of heaven, or when people talk about heaven, they usually point up.
Right. And of course, we refer to the sky as the heavens.
Yeah. And then when you hear somebody talk about hell, where do they usually point?
You go down.
Down. So,
right. So it's no coincidence, and of course, we know now through scientific events that actually, as you go down and get closer to the center of the Earth, it gets very hot. Much hotter, which is sort of how hell is described. The fiery pits of hell. So.
Now, it is important.
The correlations are interesting, to say the very least.
It is important to realize that even though people point down towards hell, we would be more referring towards Hades in this particular instance. The holding place.
Right.
For those that will one day find the lake of fire.
Right.
So that would be more Hades, down below us. But there is some...
Right, but oftentimes for those who aren't as well versed in Scripture, they use those interchangeably, so more or less they have the right idea.
Yes, and that is, it might not be the technical location.
Right, not the technical term, but they are closely interlinked and certainly related. So.
And if, most people know, or at least that acknowledge it, most people have a better idea of what hell is versus Hades, and so most people would refer towards it more as hell than Hades.
Right.
But, that is true. Anytime you ask somebody where's heaven and where's hell who actually believes in those two places, most people point down when you mention hell.
Right, and even if they don't, there are people who don't necessarily believe in the idea of an afterlife that still, that's still widely used. Oh, look at that plane up yonder in the heavens, it's just referred to widely as the sky. Not so much with going down, but you certainly hear people refer to that in other contexts, sort of extracted from the initial one, if that makes any sense.
And so I think that some could suggest that maybe that's where the screaming is coming from. But is that a sign that we should not continue digging into the earth?
Well, sure.
Or at least not to the... I think it's okay to dig, but I'm talking about
no, we can't dig it all.
Yeah,
you have a basement. I'm looking at you, buddy. You have a basement. You're not supposed to have that. So.
Yeah, I'm more referring to digging miles into the earth.
And if you've got a basement, that cannot go on any longer. You need to buy a bunch of gravel and fill it in. You cannot have a basement.
Yeah, which means if half of your house is a basement, then you just lost half of your square footage.
Right.
If your bedroom's down there, well, you better add an extension to your house.
And that's fine. Or you better get cozy with the gravel.
Yes.
So.
Well, but then you would still be underneath the earth.
Right.
So that wouldn't be very good.
No, that would not be. So on second thought, probably don't do that.
And this is something else you can respond to, what you think about this. But have you ever heard screaming? This is only to people who live in a basement. Have you ever heard screaming in your nightmares?
That is an interesting question. I'd love to hear what you have to say again. So, we often open up these questions for discussion, so you can put that in the comments down below the video here, or you can send them into GWP-international@att.net. That's GWP-international at att.net. Let us know. We'd love to hear what you have to say. So it certainly would be worth knowing, and I think a good kind of way of sizing that up is, and it's often said we're so worried about figuring out what all we can do, we don't often stop to think whether we should do it or not. And I think this perhaps is one of those scenarios. Do we actually have a purpose for drilling that deep into the earth? I don't know. As far as I know, it was mainly experimental. There wasn't actually much of a known purpose or utility for it, so probably shouldn't have been doing it.
Yeah, I think when
At
you're
least
looking
not to
at
that extent. They took it a little too far.
Yeah, when you're talking about experimental things, you need to think about, we're curious about this, but how curious do we really need to be?
Right.
Do we need to be so curious that we could be, throwing things off balance again, as you said, tipping the scales?
Right. And I'm sure there will be those.
Nature.
I'm sure there will be those when they hear this, they'll accuse us of being against scientific advance altogether. That certainly isn't the case. But I think we'll all agree that you have to draw the line somewhere.
Yeah, somewhere the line has to be drawn where you've messed and you've gone past the ethical boundaries. And some could say that when we go back to the genetic modification and
right.
if this should be done with people, if it is successful in animals. A lot of successful procedures medically that have been done on people, they were first done on animals.
Yeah.
So is it really that crazy to say that if we're trying this right now on animals, that if it goes successfully at some point, who's to say that somebody won't try to do this on a person?
Well, you say that, but you begin to see it in a whole different light when you're like, oh, well, it's one thing when it's your chicken or your hamburger on your plate that's genetically modified, but all of a sudden it's you or your little brother or something. And that all of a sudden becomes a little bit more serious. So there are a number of different ways throughout history. This certainly isn't a new thing. There are different ways that people have tried to do this time and time again. But as far as currently, another thing that we're looking at, sort of similar idea to cryopreservation, where you're trying to usurp natural bounds and sort of pursue immortality in a sense, is uploading your mind, say, to the internet or the metaverse. And we've talked about the metaverse a little bit on this podcast, and it's really interesting. Of course, that's the same company that owns Facebook that Mark Zuckerberg's in charge of. Initially, the term metaverse, he didn't come up with it. It was coined in a book called Snow Crash, which, interestingly enough, is a dystopian novel. Now, you don't even have to know exactly what the word dystopian means. If you know some basic etymology what a utopia is, that's like a sort of fantasy land. So a dystopia, of course, is the opposite of that. And it's interesting that that's where we initially find the term for metaverse, and that's exactly what it is. It's that the actual universe, in this novel Snow Crash, the actual universe has sort of fallen into disarray. It's this almost uninhabitable place that no one really wants to live, and so people just plug in, go into the metaverse to escape reality. And so it's interesting that that's what the term came from. And now there's an actual metaverse, and there's another sort of common thing, the idea that you sort of connect to escape reality, or so to speak, upload your mind, and that's another concept that's been floated in different sort of science fiction series. It's touched on a little bit maybe in Snow Crash, but the idea that, say, before you die, you'll be able to upload your mind to, say, the internet or the metaverse, and in that way be sort of immortal. What do we think about that?
I think it's really crazy.
It's a bit far-fetched, isn't it?
Yeah.
Okay.
It is, and how close do you think we would be to having something like this?
Well, I don't know. We know that the metaverse exists. I haven't had any experience personally with the metaverse. Have you?
Not at all. I really
I've had
looked into it too much.
I would say I almost have some reservation about it, just having read Snow Crash and essentially the conditions that really necessitated a metaverse, because I don't know, they were just not ideal, to say the least. And you can't help but think that with this, that people sort of get drug into the metaverse and they'll sort of neglect the actual universe, fall into disarray, and it would become next to uninhabitable. So I think that's a worthwhile concern. And you may say, oh, well, that's a little far-fetched. How could you possibly say that? Well, we've already seen some degree of sort of addiction with smartphones, and that's gone pretty far. But now you take that a step further with things, that actually mimic your surroundings, virtual reality, where it's the universe but a virtual version of it. That's even more realistic. So presumably, that would be even more easy to be drug into.
Well, and now it's even been taken a step further than
Right.
virtual reality, where you have these. I believe it would be like a pair of goggles that you put on, and then you just press, you just tap the air, and a screen
Right.
comes up. So
Right.
it's like a phone, let's just say that you have, your phone right here, but now it's just, you can just see a screen. There's
Right.
not even anything there,
I've seen
but
those.
you're wearing this pair of goggles, you're seeing your phone, so it's like right up to your face like this, but it's in the form of goggles, and then you're just tapping things because you see a bigger screen that's in front of you.
Right, and that's so they're closely related. That's an important distinction, and I'm glad you brought that up, Jake. So virtual reality, of course, mimics the actual universe. You're seeing different things like the metaverse. That's virtual reality mainly, and that imitates actual things in the universe. Like you have people, you see their avatars walking around looking like people, and you see different homes, offices, and different things in the metaverse. So that's virtual reality, but you also have sort of a fusion, say, between take like your regular serial desktop computer and virtual reality. Kind of the cross between that would be augmented reality. And for an example of what augmented reality is, these new Meta glasses where they partnered with Ray-Bans, those would be augmented reality. So they look like ordinary glasses. You can still see regular surroundings through them. They're not these goggles that you wear that cover up everything. You can only see, but they're just these glasses. You can still see the ordinary things, but they're augmented by these little panels that come up with, say, news, weather, phone calls, different updates like that.
Yeah, so it's important to understand what those differences are, as you mentioned there.
And as far as that, I think the major concern there, as far as the idea of mind uploading, is virtual reality. I would be open to actually some practical applications, potentially even with these Meta glasses or Ray-Bans, some more practical applications of augmented reality.
Yeah, I think when it comes to, new inventions, I think that more than likely I'm going to say that they should be banned, I say that about a lot of things that we do.
A little bit of that, yeah.
Well, I think that I think anything new should carefully be considered before it's put out into society.
Right,
But at the same point in time, we don't want to let that hold us back from any new inventions being added. So I do understand the argument.
Right, and of course we often use that term Luddite in the abstract to refer to someone that's generally kind of averse or objects to new technologies, but we forget that the Luddites were an actual specific group of people from the British Industrial Revolution, and when they begin to industrialize, kind of introduced more machines, which sort of replaced certain jobs. Sort of in protest, went in and smashed the machines, and they were called the Luddites, an actual group of people. And obviously, that's a bit too far, and we now know that, of course, they had to hire people, bring them in to actually service those machines, and sort of where, where technology advances were sort of able to automate or streamline existing processes more than original. Well, we'll need people to code a lot of those electronic automations, and we'll need people to service those machines and different things. So I wouldn't say, even though that concern is, and there will be some change in the job market, but I would say as old ones sort of fall out of place, likewise new jobs will come into place like that. So that concern certainly isn't anything new. If you can take a solace from that, from the British Industrial Revolution or any past historical events, that's always been a concern, and one that you look through history, we've been able to work past. So I wouldn't be overly concerned about that. Don't let it preoccupy your existence.
Yeah, and I do know that there's a lot of things that at first people have said, oh, well, this is really, really dangerous for us to have, and then it ends up being something like and this is not like something that's actually happened. I'm just taking, for example, like a microwave.
Sure.
Oh, that's really dangerous because it was new at the time, but now, as we've used them for a long time, they're considered just, everyday items.
And take air travel, for instance. The Wright brothers, who invented the aeroplane.
That's a really good example.
They were thought to be crazy. They're like, oh, you guys are trying to come up with these flying machines. You're trying to invent this. You're insane. You're going to get yourselves killed. And yet they persisted, and now that's a huge part of day-to-day life for many people in businesses and different international trade, all those different things. And so there's initially tends to always be some sense of apprehension until it really catches on. So that's another point of consideration.
It is, and when we talk about that, you also have to consider that, if the Wright brothers, they were throwing out something that sounded absolutely insane at the time.
Right.
But, we say that about new inventions right now.
Sure.
So, we were talking about how do we know what's too far? How do we know if we have gone too far with these new inventions? You could say that the Wright brothers were going too far at the time. Could somebody argue today that we would not be going too far by trying to do something that's against nature? I'm not arguing for it, but we talk about we've been going over this genetic modification as if it is something that could be really negative. How do we know that it's negative?
Sure. Well, that's interesting, and if you ask me now, a good rule of thumb on the when it comes to that experimentation is great. If you can come up with advance that's actually going to help benefit people in daily life, that's great. So I think the real concern there is when the experimentation involves harm or even loss of human life. So I think that's where we have to draw the line, is say experimentation. Take, for example, we've got the stem cells with animals, and even with humans, we've done different things, experimenting with test tube babies, and I think that there's something inhumane about that. So that's where I would draw the line. What about you?
Well, I think it's kind of difficult to say, mainly because you could say that lives were on the line when the Wright brothers tried to invent a plane.
Well, I'd say that the difference there was it was their own lives. They weren't putting other people's lives in danger per se at the start. And of course, there were airplane accidents, not to say that. But of course, these other things, when you're experimenting with human life, and certain things, you're not going to be like, we've got to take so many of these embryos for the experiment, and there's a good chance that a lot of those are going to be lost. So I wouldn't do that. But of course, something with the Wright brothers, of course, I think that would be fine. And there's actually something noble about that they risked their own lives kind of for that, potential to better transportation and, make human life easier, better. I think there's actually something noble about that. Does that make sense, kind of the distinction between those?
So if somebody is going to make this genetic modification, they need to do it to their own life? If they feel entitled to take claim to that, or feel like it's something that...
Well, I think that would be better if it were their own lives, but you still do have some ethical questions there, because if it's really a question, am I going to lose my life? I think, obviously, I think we can agree that suicide is immoral. So if this necessitates something like suicide, I would draw the line there. So
I think it would depend on, does somebody really think they're going to survive from this?
Right.
And how strong of a chance do you think it is?
Right.
If somebody says, well, it's about 50-50, that's not high enough.
Okay.
But if somebody says, I'm 98% sure that I'm going to live,
right.
At that point, it doesn't sound like suicide.
And at the end of the day, of course, you've got to kind of evaluate those risks for yourself. There is a good deal of subjectivity to that, and but a lot of interesting questions to be had there. Wouldn't you say?
Yes, and so that kind of goes, we were talking again about the genetic modification, that goes back to the woolly mammoth. Have you heard about that? How they're trying
Woolly
to
mammoth, they're
bring it back from extinction?
trying to revive it. Now, how exactly would that work?
Well, it seems similar to the genetic modification that they're trying to do that.
Okay.
It seems
okay.
like it's a similar process, and the idea is that it'll help reverse climate change. I'm not exactly sure what the argument is for that, like how that's going to reverse climate change, but supposedly people think it will reverse climate change, or at least mitigate it.
I guess the idea being that woolly mammoths were around
During a colder climate?
During the Ice Age, and that, if we were actually able to bring back woolly mammoths, that there would be enough force of nature that would kind of force things back
Counteract
into
it?
a thing. And there's been some concern of that as the broad question of global warming we've touched on a little bit. Now, if you zoom out a little bit, I think it's clear that climate is cyclical. We have an ice age, and then it warms up considerably, and there have been multiple ice ages. So I think it's clear that it's cyclical, and when we talk about usurping nature, this seems like maybe one of those things. We're trying to usher in, almost force another ice age. I don't know that that's something we ought to be doing. I think we ought to let that kind of work itself out. What do you think?
Well, especially since scientists think that we're still coming out of a previous ice age.
Right.
And so the other thing is about this, about the woolly mammoth, and I don't think this is really the reason why they're trying to do it, but you could argue if we're able to genetically modify a woolly mammoth to bring it back from extinction, can we make other animals that could affect the climate more adaptable to the climate? Can we genetically modify an animal to make that animal more adaptable to climate change?
We probably could, and we've seen some deal of that, and some certain things. I say just across the United States, in the past 50 years or so, we've seen minor changes in where different animals in different states reside, and for whatever reason, somewhere else they dumped off in that state. They didn't initially reside there, but they kind of adapted and to live in that area. But as far as that goes, I don't see what the real reason for that would be.
Well, to make people more sustainable to climate change. Could you
by making animals more adaptable?
Well, you could start there, and then you could try to make people more adaptable.
Interesting.
This would be a lot further down.
Right.
And so when we go back to the topic of climate change, do we need space colonization to combat climate change? Because the concern is that the world's going to burn up, right? Everybody's just going to burn up, it's going to get too hot and all that, right?
Well, I think that has been predicted for a very long time. I believe it was either the Mayas or the Aztecs. I think they were the Mayans that predicted 2012 would be the end of the world, and it would sort of burn up, and that would be the end of it. And we've had much more recent iterations of that, and it's never really come to fruition, and I, for one, am not terribly convinced by it. What about you?
Well, I think one concern is that we definitely have a lot more wildfires than we used to here in the United States. That's not on like a global level, of course. It's not even on a national or even a regional level, but it is becoming more common, so one could argue that they'll become so common that it becomes such an issue.
Right. Well, there certainly are a lot more fires, and a lot of that has been attributed to, say, global warming and climate change, but I believe some part of that, and probably more than people realize, is due to largely irresponsible forestry, say, as far as that goes.
Yeah, so you think people have become less careful about that, and so that's what's led to
I believe in certain areas like that's.
Some of them have been
major
human
concern,
caused.
especially say in California. We had major wildfires there recently, and that's happened before, but more so recently. And they have the Santa Ana winds there, of course, very hot in California along the coast, and you've got the forests there. And of course, there are certain precautionary things, responsible forestry. You've got to manage that. You can't let the forests get too thick or too dry, and you've got to have, and there's natural streams and water supplies, but even leading up to the fires, some of that was drained.
It was, and right now there's
Right.
A lot of debate in the state of California about how that could have been handled differently.
Right. And it's not as if it was drained naturally. Say, oh, it just went dry. It was too hot. No,
Yeah.
this was actually a decision, and I believe it was something involving fish. Be like, oh, this will be healthier to the fish, similar to in California years back when we had the sort of fad of the hydro flasks when you said save the turtles because the turtles are getting stuck in plastic straws and plastic cups, and I think it was a similar deal. They're like, oh, we have to drain this, get this water back into the ocean from these streams, so the fish can get more of that, and in doing that, that was one of those where we sort of tried to offset the scale of nature, and you see what happened there. We drained the streams that sort of fed the forests, and they went up largely in flames. So that's just another theory, and there are a number of factors that contributed to that. But I believe that's at least partly a potential explanation for what might have happened there.
Well, and another connection that could be made is, well, and there's kind of a little bit of irony, not good irony, but
Right.
bad irony in the sense that all of these things were done to save the climate, yet we just burned it up, which would have been an effect from not saving it.
Right.
So there's a little bit of bad irony, we could say, in that.
Right, absolutely, and I think that's what it is. A lot of it, whenever you hear.
Yeah,